My name is Kathy Leff, and on behalf of the Wolfsonian, Florida International University, our partners, WLRN and the Miami Herald Media Company, thank you so much for being here for our last of the inaugural Power of Design Ideas Festival. As you all know, this year the theme was complaints, but we were looking at it more as complaints as a starting point for solution as opposed to the ending point or just griping. So the whole idea of the festival was to take and look at a big theme in the Wolfsonian's collection and then bring it up to today. And as our collection begins in the late 19th century, the rise of industrialization and the immediate backlash to it, we thought it'd be really fun to take and look at, whether or not the same gripes exist today and how artists and designers have not only given voice to complaint, but how problems have been solved from a state of dissatisfaction. So that's the intent and the theme. It's been an amazing weekend for those of you who've been with us throughout the weekend. I just want to point out a couple of people who've been really instrumental. I first want to thank the Knight Foundation for its lead sponsorship that made this festival possible. Northern Trust Bank was another sponsor, along with the Terra Group, the Fontainebleau Hotel, an anonymous donor who wanted to see the debate that we had last night, The Profits of the Internet. For those of you who were there, it was just really great. I especially want to point out our partner, Jane Wooldridge and the Miami Herald. Jane and the Herald were incredibly fabulous participants and partners in this first year's festival, and that was, and they all, aside from taking on this program, which I'm really excited about, Jane administered the Solve This Miami competition, and I think you all, if you want to know more about it, you could go to the Herald's website. We gave out the $25,000 reward last night. The big complaint that came out of that there were so many great candidates, finalists for the award, and we didn't have enough money to fund them all, so if anybody's interested, stay tuned. I also want to thank Alicia and Kenny, who are here from WLRN, and their colleagues, Victor Kendall, John Labonia, for partnering with us. Alicia has been producing all the on-air content that many of you may have heard throughout the week. Kenny, who you just heard a sampling of some of the recordings from the complaints booth that was up all weekend in the cafe. So that's been really great, and they've done such a great job. And really, thank you so much for the spirit and creativity and the ingenuity of just how you've approached this. And it's really been great. So I'm going to really just turn this over to Jane, who will introduce this last program. But one other thing I want to do is I just want to thank our team, the entire Wolfsonian team. This would not have been possible without their participation. So I really want to point out first Julie Chase in the back there, who was our festival organizer, who, along with the assistance of Fatima Danji, where's Fatima? Fatima. They just did an amazing job. It really has been practically flawless in thinking that there were more than 20 events that comprise this festival. And we've had a number of participants, collaborators, partners. All of them are listed and acknowledged in bios in the program book, so I hope you take one home. And if you missed any of it, stay tuned for next year. It'll be equally as exciting. I also would like to thank Andrea Gollin. Andrea, out there. Andrea is amazing and was the architect and mastermind behind the website, really trying to create a website that would be more than a billboard for the festival, but also have content. There's blogs, we asked the community, and you still have time to do this. Sophia, we just met the other day, actually contributed a complaint and a solution again, trying to use a state of dissatisfaction to suggest how it could be solved. So if you go to the website, powerofdesign.wolfsonian.org, you'll see this incredibly rich content that was designed. All the design and the coding was done by the coolest creative agency on earth, OK Focus, and I think they're here. Are they here? They're here. There. Jules and Paul and Ryder, did an amazing. It is really one of the most, you can see all the branding of the festival, the website, all the Power of Design brand is just so beautiful, and they did an amazing job. So they're here from New York, and I really thank them for contributing to this. Again, there were many others, but I thank you mostly for being here, and obviously for being so concerned about our community to take the time and participate in the session today. So I'll turn it over to Jane Wooldridge.
Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody for braving the traffic. I think everybody has complaint number one today are a combo of traffic and where on God's green earth is the parking. All my stealth lots were taken. I think I now own Jim DeFede. Oh, I think I see a six-pack of beer coming down the pike maybe. And everybody else I'm going to owe as well. But thank you to all of you, and for those of you who will join us later through online presentations, thank you. Because what we're going to discuss today is really important to our community, to our civic health in any community, but particularly because we live here in ours. And to those of us who, on this stage in particular, are people who I can tell you, because I have seen them for years, give up all kinds of personal time, personal lives, any semblance of a personal life actually, to do work that is incredibly important, and that's watchdog journalism. And even though people think of many of our companies as sort of old media companies, well, not yours, Dan, but you know, as old media companies, the reality is ours are the only kinds of companies with the experience and the dedication and the commitment to doing watchdog journalism. So I'm really proud of my colleagues and very happy to be here today, as they are going to talk about some of the projects that they've worked on, how they've worked on those projects. Will be available for questions, and we definitely want to encourage all of you to suggest watchdog journalism projects that you'd like to see us pursue. We have a hashtag, #SolveThisMiami. You can tweet them to that hashtag, and we will definitely be watching that. Also, Kathy is going to pass around for me a little bin. And these are cards where you can sign up for our PIN network, which is the Public Insight Network. The people who are members of PIN, we ask you if we can count you as a member of PIN. And then when we have subjects that we're writing about that you may have expertise on or opinion on, we send you an email and ask you if you would like to participate by giving us your information in terms of whatever the story is. So you don't get overloaded with emails. We're very selective about only sending PIN inquiries when we think it's something up your own alley. But we really appreciate the participation of the community at large in the network, because it helps us do a better job of covering our community. So anybody who's interested in signing up, we'd be delighted to have your participation. So today we have a panel that we're calling Barking at the Bad Guys, and it is essentially the purpose of watchdog journalism is to identify problems in the community, complaints if you will, investigate those in a way that are not necessarily obvious to those of us who live someplace. Maybe we know it's a problem, but we aren't aware of the depth of the problem, the causes of the problem. Sometimes we're not aware of the problem. And then one of the things that we hope comes out of this is solutions, or a path towards solutions. And many, actually probably all of our panelists, have been engaged in this process long enough to see laws changed, to see political discourse, to see real change as a result of the work that they do. So let's get started, just so you know what we're up to. This is what really happens when I do this early in the morning. So I'm going to do quick introductions of everybody who we've got here with us today. And I am going to read because my memory is poor. Dan Christiansen. Dan, wave your hand. Okay, and you can see his photo there. Dan is editor of Broward Bulldog, which is an independent nonprofit news site which he founded in 2009. He is an award-winning former investigative reporter, not former investigative reporter, but former investigative reporter for the Miami Herald, and also for the Daily Business Review. And Dan has done remarkable work before he founded Broward Bulldog, has been doing quite remarkable work since founding Broward Bulldog. It is an online site, but they do have partnerships with some print organizations, including our own, the Miami Herald. And we run a good bit of Dan's work and the work of his colleagues. We're very pleased to have him with us here today to talk about, he's going to talk in particular about an investigation that caught my eye. I guess it was last year or the year before, but he'll be telling you more about that. Carol Marbin Miller, I have the great fortune to work with her on a daily basis, and it's in admiration and waving across the room because we don't work in the same work group. But if you have seen anything of the Miami Herald this week, you have seen the culmination of a year-long project that Carol has been involved with this year with some other people, but really a lifelong pursuit on Carol's part, defending children who cannot defend themselves. This week's project is called Innocence Lost. She will tell you more about it. It is a remarkable piece of work. If you haven't had the sense to pick up a Miami Herald this week, or perhaps just not the time, you'll find it online. The entire series is online. It's really a remarkable series, and I highly encourage reading it. I knew what was coming, and I still learned more than I think I can begin to explain about that. And Carol is really, she's one of the backbones of the Miami Herald newsroom, and we're very honored to have her in our midst. Alicia Zuckerman is the editorial director at WLRN. And she does a number of either leads or actually produces herself many of the excellent journalism programs that you hear on the radio every day. The project she's going to be talking about, it was a team-wide effort of WLRN called Zero Elevation. It's about rising seas, and I'm very happy to report that last night it took first place in an investigative series category for projects from the Associated Press. And never least is Jim DeFede. Jim used to be at the Miami Herald in our good old days, and he has since converted to the electronic broadcast side. He's on television now with CBS4 News. And what Jim does is some of the really in-depth and investigative journalism that does take place on television. I know that television sometimes gets a rap of being insubstantial, and it's not true, and it's particularly never true in any story that Jim does. He's a remarkable investigative journalist, and we're very happy to have him with us today as well. So, Jim actually is up first, and I'm going to start with a video clip. If all goes according to plan. There we go. Okay. What am I missing? We did this earlier and it worked.
Actually, could you play the other one first?
I don't have the other one keyed in for time reasons. We can come back to the other one in the Q&A.
All right.
Oh, that. Thank you. Sorry, nobody said this was my main.
Car 15 on 29 just occurred, 122-124 pass.
3:46 p.m. in the Kendall District of Miami-Dade County, and an armed robbery is in progress.
Car 15 on 29 just occurred, 122-124 pass. We don't have anybody on it to take it.
The officer offering to respond is nowhere near the crime. It would be better if someone closer handled the call, so the dispatcher takes to the air again with added urgency.
Attention all units of 29 just occurred with a gun, cash taken, subject to black male wearing a black hoodie, blue jeans, he fled on foot.
But there was someone closer, but he had his hands full. Instead of answering the repeated calls, Officer Dario Sakaris was canoodling with a young woman behind the Dayline Mall as he continues to cuddle and kiss his girlfriend. His fellow officers were slogging their way to the call.
Is there anybody on the scene? We're coming from a distance. We're not arrival yet.
18 minutes after the call first came in, units make it to the scene. By then, the suspect is long gone. Another day, another call. This one, a possible disturbance just across the street from the Dayline Mall. But investigators say they once again found Sakaris in the mall parking lot with his girlfriend. These surveillance videos, obtained by CBS4 News, were taken by the police department's internal affairs unit. IA spent months following the officers assigned to this section of Kendall, secretly videotaping and logging their activities, even using tracking devices on the officers' cars to catalog their movements. And then there's this video, according to the reports, which shows Sakaris and 2 other members of the squad drinking Cuban coffee at an outdoor restaurant when a call comes in of an infant having a medical emergency.
5 months old, non-alert, Kilo 3106, 341.
Kilo 3106 is Sakaris, a high priority call indeed. Both paramedics and police are dispatched and expected to go full out with lights and sirens. Although he tells the dispatcher he's en route, Sakaris sits there drinking his coffee. Paramedics will ultimately tend to the baby boy, who will be fine. And while he never moves, Sakaris will reportedly write in his report that he went to the scene. Wasn't Sakaris worried his supervisors might find out what he was doing? Apparently not, because this is his supervisor. Sergeant Jennifer Gonzalez. Surveillance video shows her going to Kohl's, Target, and Lowe's. Star clerks ever helpful. Internal Affairs say she should have been on the road answering calls or supervising her troops at that time. They also claim she spent hours visiting her parents in Cutler Ridge when she was supposed to be patrolling Kendall. And she too has a boyfriend that investigators say she would sometimes rendezvous with while on duty. On this day, Sakaris happened to get into a traffic accident in Coral Gables, causing a fair amount of damage to both vehicles.
Civilian vehicle, maybe 500 bucks, mine about $1,500.
Okay, which one is it, 1,000 or 500?
1,000.
A supervisor is required to investigate. The dispatcher tries raising Sergeant Gonzalez, who supposedly is on a call. In fact, she's with her boyfriend.
3180, how long before you clear reference to 17?
Gonzalez doesn't respond.
There's a supervisor on there?
A supervisor from another sector immediately responds. He wonders why Gonzalez isn't handling her own squad.
Okay, so can you check to see when she'll be clearing?
3180?
Negative, I will be able to, could he call me at a number?
Sergeant Gonzalez said she was too busy to go and would handle it by phone. Police officials argue Gonzalez's attitude infected the entire squad. When someone calls 911 from a Winn-Dixie and abruptly hangs up, officers Jeffrey Price and Fabian Owens, riding in a 2-man car, are told to investigate. Internal Affairs watched as they cruise through the parking lot, never getting out of their car, or even, for that matter, stopping. Price and Owens roll by a Chevron gas station, where there is a reported problem as well. On at least one occasion, they never even bothered driving by Internal Affairs charges. Likewise, investigators documented how Officer Ivan Thomas hung out at La Coretta and Pollo Tropical rather than taking a series of emergency calls that were backing up.
We're talking about falsification of official records. We're talking about stealing time that doesn't belong to you because they're supposed to be available for service or duty and they're not.
When CBS4 News first started examining these officers more than a year ago, former Miami Police Chief Ken Harms told us that in all his years in law enforcement, he had never heard of an entire squad ducking calls the way this one had.
Not to my recollection. And that's something that certainly in my view would be memorable.
So that was going to be the dessert.
Okay.
It's okay. No, I realized I said you too much. The other piece I was doing was more on a little more substantive than cops fooling around on the side. Was David Rivera and his shenanigans in terms of campaign finance abuse. But in terms of both of them, you know, the David Rivera campaign finance story and then this one are two examples of how TV can sort of play a role in doing investigative reporting, which is, as Jane noted, actually kind of difficult because you don't often get time. That was a good 4.5 minute piece. You don't often see that. And the point, you missed the lead in and the tag at the end because I didn't send it for time purposes, but the point of that story and the follow-up stories that we did was there really is no supervision of officers within patrol units. And that needed to be addressed. It was also amazing to me, and one of the things we pointed out was that all of these officers, they all ended up getting fired, but it took 2 years to get them fired because of different layers and all the different hoops that had to be jumped through. And I'm still following the story because the officers, through their union and through state civil service boards, are all applying to get their jobs back. And the chances are good they will get their jobs back, that it will be seen that firing was too great an offense for not going to emergency calls, believe it or not. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to point out, is how the system of checks and balances within police department is really not there. And IA, I mean, like I said, took years on that case. I had heard about that case a long time ago, and I just started tracking it. And just in terms of how I do my job, because I think that's
Yeah,
part of
I think that's part of what we want to know. Where do you get these tips and ideas?
Here's the thing. I work very different than a lot of people. Carol and others are very data driven. You know, they're very you know, getting public records, getting extensive public records documents. The Herald series at DCF, a year of labor-intensive analyzing numbers and correcting numbers and not just accepting the state's numbers, a tremendous job. I also know Carol relies a lot on people within the system to help her get information. That's what I do primarily. Primarily, my job, the way I view my job is, because TV is difficult to sort of do data reported stories, and the time isn't there to do it, and the financial commitment that the Herald made to that series is remarkable in terms of lawsuits and the rest of it that they had to file, that most TV stations, including my own, probably wouldn't be able to do. I rely instead on working sources. I'm very old school in that way of cultivating individuals, being out at crime scenes, getting to know cops, getting to know commanders, getting to know people at all different levels, in government, out of government, and I'm constantly on the phone talking to people. What are you hearing? What's going on? My favorite question, whenever I talk to somebody, my favorite question I ask them is, what should I be working on? You know, I love asking that question. It's that you can call someone with an idea and sort of say, hey, I'm interested in Dade County budget cuts as they affect the police department, and I can talk to them about that. But at the end of it, I'll always ask the question, what should I be working on? You know, because I don't know what I don't know. And the weirdest thing, I mean, if you think about it, I always love that phrase, I don't know what I don't know. And the only way for me to start to figure out what I don't know is to just ask very, very generic questions. What should I be doing? Where should my time be going? What am I missing? And not enough reporters work on that. And TV is particularly bad just because, you know, it's the crime of the day, it's the fire of the day, it's the good video of the day. This story they love because of the video of a cop schmooching with his girl. You know, they just love that. You know, but other stories that I do where you have to sort of chase after people, I'm willing to do it. And TV is a different sort of thing. But I will tell you that when that story hits, you know, every TV station follows you, the Herald follows you, and the mayor is suddenly having to hold press conferences about, well, we're going to look into this, and we have to do this, and we have to do that. And the trick is, as everyone I'm sure on this dais will say, they'll all say they'll look into it and they'll follow it up. But if you don't follow it up, they'll let it die. There's always a thing that I thought public officials do. They always take a beat and wait to see what the reaction to a story is. And they'll sort of say, is this a thud? You know, does it make a lot of noise? And then it just sort of goes away? Or is it a drumbeat? And you know, Carol, I use this example with Carol when we were, and I'll wrap up because I know you want to move on, but I think about the story of Omar Paisley, which is a story that Carol and I worked on together when I was at the Herald as a columnist. Carol did amazing work in terms of pointing out that this 17-year-old young man, or 18-year-old young man, 17, died of a burst appendix while in state custody at the juvenile detention center in North Dade. Nobody dies of a burst appendix. He writhed and screamed in pain for 3 days before a guard finally called police, or finally called paramedics in, and by then it was too late, and he died of a ruptured appendix while in custody. Carol did great stories as the events warranted. My role was between those major events to keep the story alive. And I always like to sort of like make the comparison, and you know, it's the risk that like this, the Herald series on Innocence Lost can't be ignored. But a lot of times when I was at New Times, we would do these 6,000 word stories, and they would hit like this, like a loud thud, make a lot of noise, and everyone would go, okay. But that sound, the sound I just made, disappears really quickly. What's a lot more annoying for officials is, like if I do this, eventually somebody in the front row, Kathy, or somebody is going to say, stop doing that because it's really annoying. And that's what journalism, I think, has to be. Journalism has to be this. It doesn't have to be as loud as the thud, but it has to be this for something to change. And that's where my role as a columnist when I was at the Herald allowed me to be that annoying noise that wouldn't let the officials forget. And so it's always trying to find that right balance. And that's going to be the challenge for Carol has with her series, and with we all have, is when we hit with a big story, do we follow up with it? Do we keep it? Because the politicians, they'll say all the right things when the story hits. But after that, they'll wait and see. Does anybody really care? If they moved on to the next big story, and then they'll just forget about it. So.
Thanks, Jim. At the end, if we have time, we'll come back and play your other. No, but it's a great video though. So it has some particularly classic moments in it, I thought. Carol, we really do need to talk about Innocence Lost. This is an extremely important piece of work. For those of you who have not had an opportunity to look at it, the short form is 477 children died while under the watch of Florida DCF over the past 6 years. These were all families where DCF had had previous contact with the family. It's not, somebody they didn't know about. And 477 of them died. And I think one of the things that made me cry is that our team, Carol and Audra and others, were only able to find photographs of half of those children because nobody cared enough to either take or save a photograph of the other half. So Carol, talk to us about this series, the genesis of it, the components of it, what kind of response you've gotten.
I've been writing about child welfare for probably more than 20 years now. And with the exception of a series we did at the Herald 10 years ago, most of that has been piecemeal with regard to the child deaths. We would write a story regularly when a particularly appalling or tragic case emerged. And in 2011, when Nubia Barahona was beaten, tortured, and killed by her adoptive parents, we decided we wanted to do it differently.
And by the way, for those of you who don't track this, this was a child who was found in the back of her adoptive father's car in the trunk, and I believe, had the car been torched, Carol?
No. The adoptive father killed her, according to police, put her in a black garbage bag, filled the bag with toxic and corrosive chemicals, put her in the back of his pest control truck, and he was en route to dispose of her body and almost certainly kill and then dispose of her twin brother when the chemicals in the flatbed of the truck got to him and he keeled over in his own truck. After that really horrific case, we decided we would do things differently, and instead of looking at this piecemeal, we would take a very deep dive. And I don't know why your colleagues, my bosses, didn't acknowledge this, but this actually was most of 3 years, not one. We started this series right after Nubia died, and there were breaks, of course, because there were breaking news stories that we had to do, but this was almost a 3-year commitment on our part. We asked DCF for 6 years, was 5 years, and then the last year we pulled the cases as they emerged. Death reviews, these are written reports that explore the circumstances of the child death and what happened previously with the agency. we entered all that data into a spreadsheet that we created with close to 50 different fields of information, including who were the parents, what were the allegations in all the prior reports, drug abuse, domestic violence, inadequate supervision. And at the end of the day, we took a good look at what the spreadsheet told us. We were able to identify and document patterns, i.e., parents with drug addictions are particularly dangerous. That's a fact. And clearly DCF knew this because, or someone at DCF knew it because they were creating the reports that we entered and wrote from. What they lacked that we had was I don't even know what to call it, the interest perhaps in pulling every one of those death reviews and analyzing them comprehensively. To this day, DCF has never done that. And if you look at the press releases that they have issued in the last couple of weeks saying how they helped us, they partnered with us, they encouraged us, hogwash, and that's the nice way of putting it. We sued 3 times to obtain these records, to get versions of them that were not Swiss cheese redacted. One of the biggest challenges we had was that the overwhelming majority of these kids were little bitty kids. 80% of them were 5 and under, 70% were infants and toddlers, and the prior agency history was mostly involving older siblings, and that was information that under statute they could redact. And so with the worst cases, you would get a 20-page death review, and 15 pages were redacted. The agency agreed not to fight us terribly in our quest to get to that unredacted information, and then we end up in court, and their lawyer fights. They'll deny it, don't believe them. Once we had the data, we knew what the issues were. One of the stories that we wrote involved these things called safety plans, where investigators would go into the houses of troubled families, and instead of doing meaningful social work, they would look a 7-year drug addict in the face and say, here's a safety plan, promise that you will stop being a drug addict. I can't make this up. I mean, they really did that. Or they would go to a woman who has a 10 or 12-year history of shacking up with violent, abusive men, with long criminal histories of beating women and beating children, and they would hand that woman a safety plan and say, promise to stop hanging around with men who beat you and your children, as if that worked. It didn't. And we had about 84 children who died after their parents signed one or more safety plan. These things were all written in the death reviews. That's where we got them. And yet, over the course of our 6 years of studying this, they went through death review over death review over death review saying, promissory safety plans don't work, stop doing them. And they never stopped because there's simply no one at that agency who connects all the dots. And I would argue, this may be the harshest thing I'll say, they don't want to connect the dots because to do so would require that they substantially improve funding, and no one wants to do that. Nobody wants to pay to save Florida's children. It's really that simple.
Carol, let me ask you a question. You've had a week full of stories. I know there's been a response every day out in one form or another. Talk to us a little bit about that response. You've had it from Tallahassee and other places.
Well, and Jim will remember this from Omar, and I want to say one thing about Jim. What Jim did during the Omar siege, and it was a siege, was he created a clever, compelling, emotionally driven phrase, which was, who killed Omar Paisley? And he repeated it as the first line to every column he did during that period of time. And yeah, I wrote the stories, but they would never have had the impact had he not been there week after week, pounding them. And it had some impact. There were some new policies at the Department of Juvenile Justice that said, we'll actually allow delinquent children to have health care. And again, that was lip service until another kid died a couple of years ago. A guard pounded him on the head, basically threw him on the ground, cracked his skull, and the same thing, they ignored that kid for 2 days until he died and then tried to cover it up. That's what they do. In answer to your question, the advocates are thrilled. They've been complaining about this for years, and they cannot get any traction. You have a couple of lawmakers in Tallahassee who are talking a good game, but don't believe them either because they talk a good game, but they don't want to spend money. The people at DCF are busy telling everyone that they have been our partners. They don't want to spend money because they work for the governor, and the governor has $1 billion in excess revenue that he'd rather give back to you so that you can take your wife or husband out to dinner and forget about the 500 dead children. If you hear nothing else that I have to say today, hear this. You all have to do and say something if you care about these children. They are not your children, but they are, because the primary goal of government and the primary goal of any civilized society is to protect people who can't protect themselves. And if you go home tonight and you don't write a letter to the editor and you don't write a letter to your lawmaker, then I'm sorry to say it, but you're complicit. We've all let this happen, as Fred Grimm, who has the job you used to have, said in today's column. And if we do nothing, then the next child death is on us, I'm sorry to say.
Go ahead, we have a question. Oh, wait a second. I've been sworn into getting the mic before I let people ask questions, so everyone can hear you.
A story stating what you said, that the DCF doesn't care, ignores, covers up.
I think we just spent
I mean, not
a
just on the
week doing
children,
that.
but on, I didn't read anything this week.
That's what the whole, look, we
So
don't characterize
you did out them
what
in
we write.
Tallahassee and,
Excuse
okay.
me?
You did out everybody in Tallahassee and you said,
Yes, we did.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
good job.
Thanks.
Carol, one of the things I admire about you is your ability to keep after this story when I know it has to be emotionally wrenching every time there's one of these deaths. And how do you do that? How do you keep following this without having your entire insides torn to shreds? Or are they?
And I honestly don't know how to answer that question, and I get it every day. My colleague, Audra Birch, who wrote beautifully in this series, Audra is one of the most gifted writers I know, had a real hard time with this and, shed a few tears, and I don't think she'd mind me saying that. My excuse, I guess, is that I've done this for 20 years, and you get to the point where your outrage is done. You've spent it. And maybe that's not the right answer. You still have the capacity for outrage, but you lose the emotional component because you've been there for so long. And I think part of it is just you have to close yourself off to that, or you can't do the job. It's like police officers, first responders, doctors in trauma centers. You can't let it get to you, or you can't do it anymore. And it's too important to me not to do it.
And beyond everybody in this room writing a letter to someone or someones, what else do you think the community can and should do to keep this drum banging?
Well, I think there's a sort of bifurcated answer to that. The big picture, I think you have to let your feelings known to the legislature and the governor. I think that it has to be too painful for lawmakers and the governor's office to do nothing. They've done nothing, all of them, for decades, and I mean decades, knowing full well what the consequences are of doing nothing. And again, we're complicit because we allow them to do it. We have to make it far too painful for them to go about their jobs without fixing this. Frankly, if I were a civilian, if I didn't have this job, I would be sitting in the governor's office right now. I would be so upset that I would not be sitting still. That's the big picture. The small picture is, if I were a civilian, I would be a guardian ad litem. I would be in court representing these children and trying to ensure that they get the right services and the right care, and that they get removed when they have to get removed from violent and drug-addicted parents. I would go to hospitals and hold infants who were born to drug-addicted mothers while they withdraw from their parents' methadone or OxyContin. There are a million things that people can do to be part of the solution. My daughter was born with neurologic problems, and she spent months in the hospital. And I saw little babies in those hospitals who never were visited, never. I can't even begin to tell you how much it breaks my heart. Little babies who sat in cribs for weeks without a parent ever holding them. And little old ladies from the community would come and they would sit and hold those babies because their parents didn't think it was worth their while. There are a million things you can do to help. And I think you should do them. It's what I would be doing if I didn't have this job.
Thank you for your work. Go ahead. We have another question. And
as a reporter, I do believe in prevention, and I also believe in educating the public. And if you could start a campaign on that, we have come a long way. 22 years ago, I had a gallery, the Rado, and exhibited the work of Hedda Nussbaum, the Hedda Nussbaum and Joel Steinberg case, which I don't know if it was known here in Miami.
Sure.
yeah.
And Hedda Nussbaum was looked upon as a villain, as opposed to the victim of domestic abuse. And Joel Steinberg, who killed the 6-year-old little Lisa, and nobody would put their name to it. It took until 1995 until Governor Graham appointed me and several others from different communities in Florida to the Domestic Violence Task Force. And after a while, once he stepped down, it just all died. And there must be a way that you as journalists can bring that, whether it's in articles or blogs, and educate the people at DCF. And because those caseworkers need education. It's not enough for them to go over there, see, okay, well, the moment they were there, the baby was clean in the crib, then they say, okay, and then they leave. So that's just my suggestion, is to have a running column on prevention and what these parents should look for.
I want to answer that question with regard to the domestic violence element. I'm very sympathetic to women or men who go home and are abused by their spouse or their partner. Very sympathetic. However, it is a psychopathy. It is a problem in relationships that renders the women who are a part of it incapable of protecting their children. And if you are a domestic violence victim and that renders you unfit to protect your child, I don't sympathize with that, because I don't have the number off the top of my head, but within our database, probably 100 of these cases had long-standing domestic violence allegations. And if you don't have the ability to leave your husband, who beats you every night or whatever, you're not going to be able to protect your baby from him. And at that point, the baby has to be protected more than your right to hold that baby. It's that simple. Because guys who beat their wives and their girlfriends and everyone else in sight will not hesitate to abuse and kill a child. And they do. It's fundamentally a joker in the deck. And every time it appears, you have to take swift and significant action.
This is a subject we can come back to, and we all need to at one time or another, and perhaps today. But for now, let's move on. And we're going to ask Dan Christiansen, yes, you next, to talk to us about some of the work that you do, and particularly, I had asked you to talk about the, what I will shorthand as the Saudis and Sarasota case. So if you would tell us about that series and how that initially came about.
All right, well, first of all, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about Broward Bulldog, since you probably don't, you guys are in Miami for the most part, and you may not be familiar with us. First of all, we're online only. You can see us at browardbulldog.org. We are a 501c3, so we take contributions. Contributions are tax exempt, you get a deduction. And I started that 4 years ago when I used to work with Carol. I got laid off at the Miami Herald. I am among hundreds of other people that used to work at the Miami Herald 5 or 6 years ago that no longer work there. I decided that I have a family. Instead of going out and flipping burgers or selling shoes, I decided to start the Bulldog, which, by the way, we are hoping later this year. We're about to begin a fairly significant fundraising push. We're hoping to raise enough money to be able to expand into Dade County and ultimately perhaps call ourselves the South Florida Bulldog. So keep an eye out. Anyway, the story that was being referred to here is a story that began in 2011. There's an Irish journalist, a guy named Anthony Summers, who's written a number of fairly, I don't know if they've been bestsellers, but they've done very well. And he had written a book with his wife called The 11th Day, which actually turned out to be a finalist for the Pulitzer in history last year. Anyway, I've known Tony for a long time, and he contacted me after, just as the book was being published, and said, hey, while I was doing this, I got this tip that we didn't include in the book. It has to do with Florida. You live in Florida. Would you like to help me check it out? So I said, sure. And the tip was that and he had originally spoken with a couple of people about this, one of whom was a former, or was actually a current counterintelligence officer, we are not identifying any further, who had been involved in this FBI investigation a decade ago that turns out nobody knew about, not even former Senator Bob Graham, who was the head of Congress's joint inquiry into the 9/11 tragedy. It began with Tony telling me about this, and we started pulling together, talking to different people, and what we found out and what we published originally was a story that showed that there was this family of Saudis with ties to the royal family living in Sarasota, which is about 10 miles from where some of the hijackers trained down at Venice Airport. And it turns out that the FBI had found connections between these people and the hijackers. The FBI was called in by neighbors who became concerned when the family abruptly left about 2 weeks before September 11th and left their cars in the driveway, left all their belongings at their home, food in the fridge, children's diapers, that sort of thing. So initially the sheriff's office came in, took a look at what was going on. Eventually the FBI showed up and conducted a fairly significant investigation into this, trying to find out what had happened. Now, that was all we knew at that point, and we ended up writing this story back in September of 2011. We wrote the first story. And the name of well, I won't even bore you with the names of the people that were involved. But the thing that was the most intriguing about this was the questions that it raised with Senator Graham, because he had not known anything about this, and all this was occurring at the time his committee was active on this. So he should have known about it, especially given the fact that he was from Florida, but he didn't know about it. At the time, the FBI initially wouldn't tell us what was going on. They wouldn't even confirm that this investigation had occurred, nor would the Justice Department. Within a couple of days after the story broke, and it got a lot of attention because that was one of the stories that the Miami Herald took from us, they ran it on the front page, so it got quite a bit of attention. And so the FBI, a day or so later, finally put out a statement denying that there had been any, confirming that they had done this investigation, but saying that they hadn't found anything, no connections to 9/11. And they said that a couple of times. We actually wrote a couple of stories about it. It wasn't until about, so this story basically sat there. In the meantime, we had filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Justice Department and the FBI seeking whatever records they had about this. And bottom line was we kept being denied, appeals denied. Eventually, about a year later, we finally filed a lawsuit that later bore some fruit. It's still continuing, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. In early 2012, we managed to get some other documents from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that showed that the FBI, an FBI agent and a local cop from Sarasota had interviewed a suspected terrorist who had been caught on something, arrested on something, in jail, and this guy had told him that the guy who lived in Sarasota, whose name was Al-Hiji, that was the last name, was an acolyte of bin Laden's, and was also tight with a guy named Adnan Shukr-Juma, who is sort of our own homegrown terrorist here from Miramar, whose father, now deceased father, ran a mosque up in, I believe it's actually in Miramar. But he's now got a bounty on his head of $5 million the U.S. is looking for him. So here you have this guy who was a terrorist. He's now been convicted. He's been labeled as an international terrorist associate, giving the FBI information, and I've interviewed him since then, and he's confirmed this, that this Al-Hiji guy who lived there, where the hijackers supposedly went, had ties to not only Shukr-Juma, but also not directly to Al-Qaeda, but was quite interested in Al-Qaeda. And by the way, I should back up here just for a minute. The reason that the undercover agent that we spoke to told us about what was happening was he was very concerned that this had not come out over a decade. And he said that, we asked him how they knew for sure that Muhammad Atta, some of the other hijackers, had been to this home in Sarasota where these people lived. And he said that it was an upscale home in a gated community. And in order to get in there, people had to sign in and out. They also had their license plates photographed. And those things were all done, and the agent saw that, according to our source, and that's how they could tell for sure that these hijackers had gone to this home. Later on, the FBI claimed that they can't find these particular records, so we're not quite sure why. Anyway, through all this, Graham keeps coming back. We wrote several stories about him saying that the FBI has been less than forthcoming about this. Ultimately, in one of our more recent stories in December, he actually went so far as to say the FBI hindered Congress's inquiry into 9/11, which is an extremely strong statement. And he said it under oath. He said it in an affidavit that he filed basically in support of the lawsuit that we have filed seeking information seeking the FBI's files. But the lawsuit did yield one thing, 31 pages. Remember, we filed suit. They denied they wouldn't give us anything, claimed they didn't have anything, as I recall. And then unexpectedly, about 6 or 8 months into the lawsuit, they released, all of a sudden I go out to the mail, and there is this package from them, and there's 31 pages, heavily censored pages, but there were chunks of it that you could read. And in a couple of those documents, one in particular, it says in there very specifically that the Saudis who fled that home, folks with ties to the royal family, had, quote, many connections, unquote, to people involved with the terrorist attacks of September 11th. Now, this flies in the face of what they said publicly, which is to deny that they found anything. So we're not at a quandary. We know what they found, but we have them publicly saying one thing and their paper is saying another. That's why we're trying to get the rest of the documents to find out exactly what happened here. They've continued to resist us. They've now started to claim that releasing these documents would disrupt national security. They never claimed that initially. And they actually went to the point saying that they told a judge, and a senior FBI official told a judge that if they were to release this classified information about these Sarasota Saudis, it would, quote, reveal current specific targets of the FBI's national security investigations. What that's all about, we're not quite sure what they're talking about, except that we know from some of these documents that have been released that say that somebody who was related to these family members of these Saudis here was also taking pilot training lessons in Venice at the same airport with Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shehi, who was the guy who flew the, Atta was the guy who flew the plane in the first tower, al-Shehi flew the plane into the second tower.
Dan, what's
I don't know what else to tell you about. That's kind of where it stands. This is an example of an investigation that can take a lot of time and doesn't necessarily lead to complete answer, complete clarity as to what's going on. We're hoping at some point it might, but so far it's not. But these are the sorts of things that we all do here, writing about things that we hope to get answers for, and in this case we've gotten some, but not all that we want.
And what are the implications here that the U.S. government knew more, that because, is the underlying implication that the U.S. government in one of its, or some part of the U.S. government, may have facilitated the extraction of people involved in this attack to protect some other resource or concern that we have in the intelligence community?
Not in this case, because these people left before 9/11. What seems to be apparent here is that, I mean, we know for a fact the FBI did an investigation. We know for a fact from these documents that they found connections between them and the hijackers. Why did they not tell that to Congress? The documents, by the way, that stated that they knew that there were connections between the hijackers and these people, those documents originated back in 2002. So they knew, but the 9/11 Commission was never told about this. You know, so we are somewhat mystified. However, there is an operative theory here, and that theory is that one of the FBI agent who was the lead investigator on this case, whose name is escaping me at the moment, later we learned he was transferred from investigations in Sarasota to counterintelligence within the FBI. We've talked to a number of people that suggest, and that the reason that he transferred over was because he flipped this guy that lived in the home. His name was Al-Hiji. And if he did...
What's flipped? That's a good question. That he turned him into a U.S. spy?
Yes, turned him into an asset, a U.S. asset for the FBI, and that when he made this transfer to counterintelligence, that this information that came out of this case was transferred behind the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act wall within the FBI. Now, is this true or not? I don't know. It's just sort of a working theory to explain why does the FBI contend that it has no other records on this when they conducted a major investigation that we know lasted for at least 3 years, and probably lasted longer than that. So there are many questions that we don't know. We do know that this is a significant event that occurred here in Florida, and that the FBI investigated it. Congress was never told, and there are a number of people in Congress that want to find out. This is also sort of accompanying another thing that's happening, and that is a large chunk of the report that was done by by Senator Graham's Joint Committee has been censored since it was released in 2002. 28 pages specifically about who was involved, or I think the way it was phrased was possible financing of the hijackers in the United States. strong scuttlebutt is, this is all about Saudi Arabia. We have moved, we're currently, our attorney, a guy named Tom Julin, wonderful First Amendment attorney here in town, has filed papers. We're seeking what's called a mandatory declassification review, hoping to get these records opened up. Congress, several congressmen recently filed a House resolution seeking to do the same thing. Families, there's a group called, I can't remember the name of the group, but it represents 6,600 survivors, family members of 9/11. They are supporting this, trying to make this happen. They asked me just last week, the Miami Herald and the Sarasota Herald Tribune had asked to file friend of the court briefs in our case, and the court, after waiting about 4 or 5 months, finally let them do it. They have to file it by Tuesday, so there should be more written about all this next week. I'm going to write something when they file it, see what it says. There's all this stuff happening out there on this. And in a way, I just want to mention one other thing. Just to contrast it, we have no resolution. God knows when we will get a resolution of this. But other times we write things and things happen quickly. As with Carol's story, she's getting something happening. Whether it's going to be satisfactory is another question. I wrote something in January about governmental entities called special districts and how they don't require lobbyists to go before them to register. Unlike, if you go to the city commission and you want to lobby somebody there, you have to register, disclose who you're working for, that sort of thing at special districts. And these are things like South Florida Water Management District, in Broward County, the North Broward Hospital District, airports, a lot of things. They don't require them. Within a week of that story, the legislatures were all hot and bothered about it, and they've already introduced legislation to change that. So sometimes, you can get a quick hit, and sometimes it just, life goes on and on and on, and you got to keep pushing. As he said, you have to keep that drumbeat, and that's what we've tried to do, certainly with the 9/11 story.
Thank you. Alicia is also going to talk about a project that I think is an ongoing drumbeat conversation. Would you like me to play the audio first, or do you want to talk about it first?
Let me just set up the audio, okay. which is just to say there's not too much to say setting it up other than the fact that you just have to know that when Tom Hudson, who was hosting this special that these next few minutes came out of, refers to Andrew, he's referring to Hurricane Andrew, which was the catastrophic hurricane that changed so much about life in South Florida in 1992. And that's really the only thing I need to say to set up the tape.
The asphalt is broken. The fact that the paved street was never made to contain water.
Brian Norcross. He was instrumental in getting vital information to South Floridians throughout Hurricane Andrew back in August of 1992. Rising seas has no face like Andrew. It's a slow, changing process, and the time frame that sea level rise works on opens up a lot of room for variables.
Wanless is a geologist at the University of Miami, and he says if you look at the past, sea level rise happened in rapid, catastrophic leaps.
They're barrier islands, just like the ones today, left on the seafloor, just left there.
Wanless says past sea level rise shot up because somewhere an ice sheet collapsed suddenly, and he thinks we're starting to see that again. At this point, though, ice sheet melt effect isn't really built into the climate change models. It's more or less tacked on using expert judgment. That's part of why you get expert projections that span anywhere from 2 feet
to 20 feet.
They're personal takes on the science.
You get sort of a glimpse into the future of what coastal flooding will start to look like as the sea level rise issue becomes more prominent.
Dr. Anna Pushkin-Shevlin is an urban planning consultant based in Delray Beach. She says king tide flooding serves as a wake-up call for coastal communities.
We saw the waters come up and cover the streets and flood the lawns, and this only happened for an hour or two during the high tide. But eventually, this will become a norm.
Sea level rise is not included in the repair plans for the county's 3 wastewater treatment plants. The county's oldest plant is about 60 years old. It sits on Virginia Key, a small, unprotected barrier island. So it doesn't smell that bad here.
Treatment plant's working today.
Doug Yoder is the Deputy Director of the Miami-Dade Water and Sewer Department. Yoder says the county will still fortify its wastewater treatment plants against rising waters, even though that's not explicitly written into its agreement with the EPA, called a consent decree.
EPA has no specific requirements, no rules associated with sea level rise or climate change.
The pines of Big Pine Key are disappearing. Despite the changes he sees on his land, Robert Eric says in some ways, it's still the quiet rural island he discovered back in the 70s.
I remember coming to Florida after being in Hawaii and the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and Central America and being kind of disappointed until I got to the Keys, because then I was out of the country again.
Back then, high tides would cover his property maybe 5 times a year. Now, he says it's more like 30. His land is now dotted with the skeletons of trees like slash pine, poisonwood, and varnish wood. In their place, red mangroves are thriving because they do really well in salt water.
My neighbors would come down and have a glass of wine on my patio out there, and we'd watch the kayakers coming down the middle of A1A.
Molly Myers has been in the same house since 8th grade. She's seen the water come across the road before, lapping up against the seawall that separates her house from A1A. But the destruction of last year was a first.
I'd never seen it come across the way it did that time, again and again and again.
The waves from Sandy and some small storms just after ate away at the sand, causing sections of road and sidewalk to fall into the sea like piano keys or falling dominoes. But remember, Sandy wasn't a big storm. To explain the uncharacteristic destruction, many pointed to sea level rise. Len Berry is director of the Center for Environmental Studies at FAU.
In many parts of the globe, 6 inches of sea level rise doesn't make much difference. In South Florida, it does.
The Caribbean Community, or CARICOM, started sounding the sea level rise alarm in the early 1990s. Today, it's recommending that the basin nations begin erecting more than 200 miles of levees and seawalls at a cost of almost $6 billion. Problem is, the Caribbean doesn't have that kind of cash in the best of times, and these aren't the best of times. In fact, the Caribbean is currently home to 5 of the world's 12 most indebted countries. The Caribbean islands and the 40 million people who live on them produce less than 1% of the greenhouse gases that many scientists blame for the global warming that's causing rising sea levels. As a result, the basin's leaders say developed nations should help finance the Caribbean mitigation tab.
So that was, I think, about 4 minutes from an hour-long documentary that we did about sea level rise in South Florida called Elevation Zero. But that 1 hour was part of a week of coverage that included a special hour every day of the week and 18 different radio stories in addition to that, as well as a lot of different online-only and social media kinds of coverage. So this story was about how do you cover a slow-moving threat? How do you cover something that doesn't have something that's so specific to sink your teeth into and say, here's what's wrong? There's so much that's wrong that we had to look at. And so our approach was to look at that through the lens of science, through the lens of policy, and through the lens of individual stories, which I would argue for our purposes, the purposes of an audio audience, is probably the most important, that individual stories, and that's probably true in telling the investigative stories in general. The narrative is so important, finding the individual stories, finding how the policy or lack of policy, finding out how the science, finding out how the sea level rise in this case is affecting individual lives, and you just heard some examples of that. There are many, many more. Sammy Mack, who's in the audience here, did a report on how teachers here are dealing with sea level rise in their classrooms and got some really great voices on that. There were so many that obviously couldn't fit into the 4 minutes, but so that was obviously, it was a tall order, made taller by the fact that our listening area covers the Palm Beaches all the way down to the Keys. And so we had to find ways to tell stories out of all of those regions, which we did. You heard from Nan Klingener in that clip, which was, she's our correspondent down in the Keys. You did not hear from Greg Allen, who is from NPR, and we went to Greg and we asked him, hey, we would like this story about this. We heard that Key West is building its new firehouse 18 inches above regulation because of sea level rise, that they're planning ahead. Greg Allen took on that assignment. It wasn't an assignment from us. We can't give him assignments, but as a suggestion. NPR did give him that assignment, and so that story aired nationally, as did many of these. But ultimately, you know, this was, I should say, as far as the process, sort of the behind-the-scenes process goes, this was a story that our entire news operation took on. Every single person, from our vice president, Tom Hudson, who was also the host of the hour-long programs, to every one of our interns, was reporting on this story. And we approached it kind of like somebody, our program director, Peter J., said, why don't we take this on like Shark Week? Why don't we do what happens, you know, on TV for Shark Week with sea level rise? And because, you know, people don't always, it's something that people don't always think about in their everyday lives if they don't know that what they're encountering is because of sea level rise. We were sort of charged with figuring out how to hold a, you know, microscope up to those things and show people like this is happening because of sea level rise, and have our audience kind of tell each other that's how we were doing it. We had done this once before with our Hurricane Andrew anniversary coverage, which was a full press newsroom effort, and we just, what was interesting about this, which is very different from our day-to-day work when we're going about our business, everybody's working on a different story, everybody has a different set of expertise and a different beat. For this moment, we all came together around this one beat, which was rising seas. You know, it's a story I think that we're still going to be telling in 50 years, but ideally, because of this kind of coverage and because of the coverage that this will spur and the activities that I hope that this kind of coverage will spur from the community, from citizens, that the way that we tell the story in 50 years will be different because of the way that we're telling the story now. So, you know, the bottom line is, why do we tell these stories? What's the point? You know, any of these stories, not just the sea level rise stories. And the bottom line is really that it's about giving people, giving the public, giving citizens the tools to live their lives in a more meaningful way, and that ultimately means figuring out ways to make changes and to hold people accountable who need to be held accountable. One of the things that kept coming up in the Elevation Zero reporting, which was frankly very disturbing, which is that sea level rise was so much of an afterthought in policy planning. And what happens when that kind of thing is an afterthought in planning policy? Well, look at what happened with Katrina. Look at what happened in New Orleans with Katrina. That's what happens when it's an afterthought and not part of the planning process. So less than a week after our Shark Week on Elevation Zero aired, the Miami-Dade County Commission chairwoman announced that they were going to take a long, hard look at, let me get the exact wording here, sea level rise in every detail of infrastructure and development. So that's a step. What also happened was that the national program Here and Now, which is an NPR program based out of Boston, aired its own sea level rise series, which was our sea level rise series. They worked with us and our reporters. And so that megaphone, sort of the reach of our megaphone here in South Florida got wider. And on some level I thought, well, it matters a lot more that our South Florida audience hears this and understands it and internalizes it and that they know that they have work to do. Like, that matters more than having these stories have a national audience. But, you know, as far as the officials and the scientists and the people who can actually dig in and make the changes on a policy level and on a scientific level, the way that happens is when there's sort of like a critical mass. Someone last night, and I can't remember because I went to so many of these sessions, somebody last night in one of the sessions said that when there's a critical mass of complaint, that's how change happens, when it reaches a critical mass. And I think reaching this national audience and reaching a bigger and bigger and bigger audience means that there's a critical mass, hopefully means that we get to reach a critical mass. And guess what? It turns out that the rest of the country really cares about what happens in Florida, about South Florida. I mean, we know that because we know about our tourist industry here. We know how much we rely on that, and we know how much the rest of the country relies on Florida. We're sort of in an unusual position where the rest of the country actually does care about our local issues. So that's kind of in a nutshell how we put this whole thing together and what it was. There's so much behind it, and you can hear and read the rest of our stories at WLRN.org, and you can suggest stories and let us know what we're missing, what we should go forward with. Like I said, we didn't do a week of sea level rise coverage and then we're done. There's a lot more to do, and we still want to know, what your stories are, what your experiences are with sea level rise, what you think needs to be changed, and not just with sea level rise, obviously, but we don't know what we don't know, as Jim said. It's so true. So, and we have to keep banging the drum. That was a good audio reference there. I like that.
A little bit of radio.
You certainly do.
Alicia, I think you said that really well, the sense that the reason we tell these stories is because we need to hold people accountable, and all of us who live in a community have that responsibility. So our responsibility as journalists is to make sure that the community, we do what we can do to make the community aware. Is that kind of where you're heading?
Yeah, I mean, it's twofold. It's exactly. I mean, it's one that we hold officials accountable, but we have to. I think it's less about holding the public accountable and more about letting you know what we find out, and ultimately giving the public the tools to do what needs to be done, to change what needs to be changed.
Question. Where's my friend with the mic? Hang on. Okay. Hi.
First of all, I wanted to thank all of you for the tremendous job and contribution you do make to the community in doing your investigative reporting. I think we owe you a real debt of gratitude. I wanted to ask a more general question, and that is, as somebody that has spent almost my whole life in this community, one of the things that I resent terribly, and I have been a community activist my whole adult life, is that for some reason our community is always number one in Medicare fraud, identity theft, corruption, all of the things that you, as part of investigative reporting, journalism, report on. And we say we want to hold the policymakers accountable, but there's something inherent in the community that seems to me that makes us number one in all these categories, and I wonder if you could kind of address that.
So leadership, I think.
Leadership?
I don't think we have. I think there's been a lack of leadership over the years, and that's one reason. But yes, I mean, we're a transient community. I live in Broward. It's just as transient as it is down here. That is a factor here. But people are, I mean, there have been a number of studies that have shown that people in South Florida, that Florida is, this was a study done by the Bob Graham Center at the University of Florida and the Lou Fry Center, former congressman. It basically found that Florida was the most disengaged state in the nation, and that South Florida was pretty much the most disengaged part of the state. We are low in participation, attending meetings, voting, all sorts of things. So,
let me just sort of say, as a journalist, I'm very happy that we are rife with corruption and scandal, and it keeps me employed.
It's good for business.
It may be a lousy place to raise a family, but it's a great place to be a reporter. I've actually I have my own theory, and part of it is Florida has always been a place where people go for a second chance. Whether it's Cuba, Haiti, Mexico, or Latin America, or New York, Chicago, or somewhere else. People come here usually after failing somewhere else, and then they arrive in South Florida. They come here for some other reason. Florida is a place of second chances, and the thing about second chances are I don't want to tell you about what I did when I was, in the Tantamacud in Haiti, and I don't want to tell you when I was a crooked businessman in New York and I've relocated to Florida. I don't want to tell you really about my past. So one of the things that happens is I don't ask about your past. So we don't ask each other critical questions about each other's past. The other thing too is we are so desperate to want to be substantive, to want to be important, to be a world-class community. Unlike New York and Chicago and LA, which have sort of matured over a greater period of time, that we are easy prey for hucksterism. I will always remember my favorite story is Futanga dit Bobani Sissoko. Anyone remember Futanga dit Bobani Sissoko? West African fellow who came to Miami in shackles. He was brought here in leg chains and hand chains because he had been extradited from Switzerland, where Interpol arrested him after he was indicted in Miami for trying to bribe officials to send military attack helicopters to some West African country. And he came to Miami with a fortune, with a huge fortune. He posted the largest bond in the history of South Florida. And he was released after posting like a multi-million-dollar cash bond. He rented a suite of floors at hotels. He rented condos. He hired every attorney in South Florida of big names and gave every single one of his attorneys a Mercedes-Benz. He tipped the valet $100 every single time they came and parked one of his cars. He handed Rolex watches out to people. There was a great story in the Miami Herald about how, as he walked through the Intercontinental Hotel one day, he heard a marching band, I think from Northwestern, play at a bar mitzvah. And he wondered, why is this marching band playing this bar mitzvah? And he was told, well, they had been invited to the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and they needed to raise $50,000 to be able to buy new uniforms and go to New York.
Northwestern High School.
Northwestern High School. And so he stopped and wrote a check for $100,000. Here. And this is, I love the Herald. This is when I was at New Times and used to bash the Herald. And even when I was at the Herald, I bashed the Herald. But nobody at the Herald, nobody in the community, nobody did a story that said, this guy's a crook who came to Miami and is spreading all this money. And where did this money come from? Well, eventually he donates a lot of money to Camilla's house. They agree to drop the charges or mitigate the charges against him. He's allowed to do house arrest back in West Africa, as if anyone could actually hold you accountable for house arrest in West Africa. And a year later, a group of men came from the United Arab Emirates and said, we represent this bank and he's embezzled, $300 million from our bank, and all the money he was floating around here was stolen money. And we all went, huh? That's Miami. We don't ask questions. If you spend money, we'll treat you as if, because money equals success in our mind. So if you spend money, you must be a great man. If you come here, we don't care much about your past because we don't want you asking about ours. We are a very live and let live group, and that is great prey for the hucksters and scammers and the rest of it, whether it's in Medicare fraud or tax identity fraud or any of the rest of it, public corruption. That's what we are. God bless it. It keeps me working.
Okay, Jim, I think you actually have summed it up remarkably well. We'll take one more question. I know we're over time, but I hate to ever cut anybody off.
The investigative and watchdog journalism, it's pretty labor intensive. And newspapers, I know, are under financial pressure every place. I'm guessing that the Herald is less capable of doing this kind of work as it might have been a few years ago. I guess my question is there do you see developing some relationship between newspapers and blogs like yours, Dan, as a way of extending
We've
this?
already done that.
Everybody up here actually is a partner with one another. All these 4 organizations are partnering, and if there are some good things that have come out of this moment of duress and what we do, it is that those partnerships have become critical to all of us, and I think we're all better for it.
Well, I don't know about that,
Okay.
because I would say that the Miami Herald gets to run my stuff for a whole lot less money than they used to pay me. The bottom line is that investigative reporting, whether it's done by television, whether it's done by, you know, a newspaper, whatever. It's expensive because it's labor intensive. And that's basically why the newspapers have downsized it. I mean, there used to be a whole team of people like Carol. Now there's Carol, and there's Carol. And Casey, who is her editor. And then she pulls in other
we are
people.
posting one more job. We have posted one more job.
Oh, really? Well, that's
So
great.
now we'll have two
But
instead
even-
of, we used to have 10.
Right, but there's a lot, I mean, and this is happening not only here, it's happening, you know, all around.
And I just real briefly, the politicians know we're shorthanded.
Yeah, I think that's
The
true.
bureaucrats know we're shorthanded. And the latest trick is, it's got to come to a head at some point. And you heard three of us talk about lawsuits that we've had to bring certain things about. You know, I filed a public records request the other day, and the state attorney's office said, okay, that'll be $7,200 to fulfill your public records request. Every single one of us has been told some insane number to try to get access to our records. And that's how they're going to try to beat us, because I have to go to my boss and say, you want to spend $7,200 on this?
Jim, were that particular request, because we've seen this come around too, is that usually in copying papers? Is that how they're?
It's in reviewing files and then charging per hour and estimates. And by the way, I ended up raising enough stake where I got all the information without them charging me a dime, because I started challenging and pushing back and really being aggressive with them as to document. I want to know exactly, and I want to sit there and watch the person who's going to do this for 40 hours a week at $20 an hour for the next 13 weeks, as you claim it's going to take, when my request was very specific and narrow. And to be honest with you, I have started self-censoring. Whereas I used to ask for much broader records requests that might lead me down new paths that I might not have realized what I don't know, I had to start tailoring my requests very, very specifically to get that piece of information. And I don't know how much I'm missing because I'm starting to self-censor myself that way. And that's a scary trend, and that's something we have to fight. Otherwise, the watchdog journalism role isn't going to play anything long.
Dan, let me ask you a question. Because of the scenario that you're in a not-for-profit that you started, how are you financing those lawsuits? Because I know that that's not an inexpensive.
Right, well, basically the kindness of our pro bono attorney, Tom Julin. He's doing it pro bono for free. And there are expenses that we have to take care of from time to time, but he charges his other customers $800 an hour, and I joke with him that the reason he's charging them 800 hours is because he's doing all this free stuff for us. But thank God for people like him, frankly. Well, that's how he's doing. After the Miami Herald laid me off, the newspapers, the internet undercut the newspaper's business model. You'll notice now you don't see very many classified ads in the newspaper. You don't see a lot of other kind of ads too. Those used to be bread and butter. They were taken away, online, and as a result, the newspapers don't have the money to pay the staff anymore. It's a very simple equation, and nobody's managed to figure out what's the solution.
Bullshit. The reason why there are cuts and layoffs is newspapers and TV stations are publicly held companies, and they're more interested in profits.
Well, that too, of course.
And they are in doing advocacy journalism, and yes, it's partly classified, but at the bottom line, it's greed. Miami Herald still makes money. And Miami Herald is not a money-losing venture.
Yeah, but they ain't making what they used to make.
All right, they ain't making what they used to make.
Not anywhere near.
We're making a fraction of what we used to make. And I got to
correct.
say one thing.
But
look.
It's a combination of both. He's correct.
We're owned by a chain, and we thought it was one of the good guys until we realized they were going to rape and pillage like all the other chains. Hold your ears. She's one of my bosses. But in defense of the Miami Herald, I have to say this. They broke free several reporters. We hired a freelancer at thousands of dollars to help us. We had designers. We had a guy who did nothing but the online design. We had an editor who I was getting emails from at 2:30 in the morning. And God bless the Miami Herald. You know, when I walk out of here, I will bitch and moan like the next gal, and I will trash my bosses all day long. But God bless them. I mean, what they devoted to what we just did is unheard of in this day and age.
But you have that because you have dedicated people like this one here.
And you
And
have.
if you didn't have that, and Casey Frank and stuff like that.
That's true,
But he's
but that-
correct. He is
things
absolutely
are true.
correct about, you know, the fact that I mean, look what's happened to the newspapers. I mean, they just sold the Miami Herald building. What happened to all that money that was local money that was used to build it? It all went to California, except for 50.
It went to a pension
It
obligation
actually
that
went
had
to our
nothing-
pension fund.
Exactly.
To a pension fund.
So
that
they
had
have
virtually
stolen
nothing to
from
do-
the community, as far as I'm concerned. And the same thing, by the way, let me, hold on a minute, let me finish this, because it's important. It's happening at the Tribune Company, which is the Sun Sentinel, too. The whole Tribune Company is about to split into two, TV side, paper side. The TV side is currently setting it up, from everything I've read in the Los Angeles Times and elsewhere, to basically rape the newspaper side. The Sun Sentinel does not own a downtown building, even though their name's on it. They do own a big printing facility in Deerfield Beach. It was built with local Sun Sentinel money. Now, the way the deal's being structured, the Sun Sentinel is going to have to pay rent to have their, to have their papers printed there. That's what's happening, and that's definitely.
This is not a small
what he said.
subject. It is a subject that affects all of our lives every day. I do want to give the Herald credit for, which Carol did, for really loosening up resources for that project. But you're right. We would love to be doing many more projects that we aren't doing. I want to applaud all of the people here for their dedication, the work that they do. They all, I can guess that everybody here went to school with an awful lot of people who make multiples of their annual salary. And it's not because they're smarter. It's because people like this are driven to do work because they think it's important for the community. And so I applaud all of you for being investigative journalists, and for all of you in the audience and our audiences beyond this room. Please remember that even though you think you don't need to pay for that information if you get it online, these are the people who are producing that information, and it is not inexpensive. And if you don't support journalism, then there is no journalism. So thank you for this opportunity to be with all of you.